So look, Ben is just going to get up our next guest, and as a precursor to that, I want to tell you that in the last, I think, 24 hours or so, just 3 hours ago, Israel has announced that it's closing its embassy in Ireland. Its Foreign Minister, Gideon Saar, announced the closure of the country's embassy in Ireland on Sunday, accusing Ireland of extreme anti-Israel policies. The actions and anti-Semitic rhetoric used by Ireland against Israel are rooted in the delegitimisation and demonisation of the Jewish state. Along with double standards, Ireland has crossed every red line in relations with Israel, the minister said, and boy, that's quite strong, to actually close your embassy. But given some of the rhetoric I've seen from Ireland, I can understand why. Meantime, back here, super political grifter John Minto is trying to put pressure on the government to make a declaratory statement about whether or not we would grant visas to members of the Israeli Defence Force who sought to holiday here. The Australian government, as I understand, has said that IDF members holidaying or visiting Australia may be subject to some sort of sanction, arrest or refusal because of the International Criminal Court's of Justice rather woke pronouncements about the conflict in Gaza. And I guess all this comes after a year or more of, I think at times, very hurtful and surprisingly anti-Semitic activity here and around the world in the wake of a terrible terrorist attack on October 7th, 2023 in Israel. We spoke to the Israeli ambassador on his departure last week, and it'd be fair to say I was somewhat shocked by his admission that his family, his kids, had been subject to anti-Semitic discrimination and attacks here in New Zealand. And Israel certainly by some is being painted as a pariah. How has the year been to be someone connected with Israel in New Zealand? Are we as bad as the Irish or not? Joining us now is David Cumin from the Israel Institute. David, lovely to have you with us again. Season's greetings.
Sean. Yeah, and to you. Merry Christmas to everyone.
All right. Are you surprised by this move in Ireland? Just how poorly has Ireland been treating Israel?
Abysmally, and I think the nail in the coffin was really the Irish insistence that the definition of genocide be changed so that Israel could be prosecuted by the International Criminal Court.
When did they do that?
It was a letter. It was a letter a few days ago where Ireland essentially said, "We think that the definition of genocide is too narrow, and we want to appeal to the ICC to broaden the definition so that Israel can be prosecuted fully." Much like Amnesty has done, much like many of the other supposed human rights groups have tried to do.
Yeah, we're going to mention genocide later in the week in terms of me looking back on the year. In fact, I'll tell people now, I've been looking for the word of the year, whether it be best used or worst used. And I think genocide in the year of 2024 has been the most overused, abused, misused word all around the globe. And it really is Orwellian the way that word and its meaning, there's been an attempt to completely change it in the interests of a political position.
Quite. The even more disappointing thing about this is it's not new. I'm old enough to remember 2018 when Golriz Ghahraman stood up and said that Israel was committing genocide then. These people have been trying to get that mud to stick for a very long time. And now they have the backing of the United Nations even more than they ever have. It's disgusting. And our government hasn't stood up to it, like many other governments haven't stood up to it. But the Irish have been standout, one of the worst in the Western world.
Along with South Africa, I guess.
In the Western world.
In the Western, yeah. Okay, looking at what's happening in Australia, my understanding is they may have some sanctions or threatened sanctions against IDF people travelling or holidaying in Australia. Are you aware of the details of that?
I know of a specific case where a great-grandchildren of a woman who was going to be turning 101 were denied entry because they were serving in the IDF, as is compulsory for every Israeli citizen, by the way. And as I understand it, I think one of her great-grandchildren has now been allowed in, and there's still appeals on the other case. It's very sad. It's very sad.
It's bizarre. They are members of a legitimate military force that Australia, in a country that Australia has diplomatic relationships with. It seems very odd.
Well, more than diplomatic relationships. They're both liberal democracies. They are aligned in many, many, many respects. It's not just that there's a diplomatic office in either country. It's deeply disappointing, and I hope there's a full inquiry.
Well, there are calls from John Minto for our government to do the same, and I have to say, I got the distinct impression from Ambassador Jacoby when I interviewed him last week that his feeling was that New Zealand hasn't exactly stood by Israel in regards to all of this, and maybe and he's calling on our government to impose the same sort of sanctions on restrictions or IDF members visiting New Zealand. What would you say to Mr. Minto and his ilk?
Well, first of all, of course he is. He has been for the last, ever since I could remember. He's been trying to make Israel a complete pariah state using all of the buzzwords in most Orwellian ways. So it's hardly surprising that he's using the opportunity of the war to further push that wheelbarrow. What's really disappointing, of course, is that our government doesn't seem to be pushing back terribly hard. I mean, the ill-informed statement of our Prime Minister to say that he would arrest Netanyahu if he visited New Zealand, despite the fact that there is a strong basis in international law to say that the sitting Prime Minister of a democratic country not signed to the Rome Statute is immune from prosecution, didn't really seem to be top of mind, or I would suggest that our Prime Minister hasn't been well briefed. Much like our Foreign Minister hasn't been briefed on many of the issues.
Well, it hasn't been well briefed, or do we have? And heaven forfend this should be the case. Do we have a bunch of woke people inside MFAT and Foreign Affairs who are misbriefing our leaders?
I don't want to say anything defamatory, but the evidence.
Well, so you're saying yes.
We know that they have not told our Foreign Minister about many of the issues with our funding of UNRWA, for example. And rather than come out and argue the substantive points of UNRWA hiring terrorists, teaching hate, promoting and inciting violence, rather they've told NetSafe and the police that their staff feel emotionally unsafe with us exposing them.
Oh, God. The old cry-bully excuse.